Every board has that one person who asks a lot of questions, doesn't go along with everybody, and seems to be just a complete disruptor. Contrarians. Pros, cons, and tips on how to manage them, especially when it comes to fundraising. That is our focus. Let's huddle up. Hey, welcome to another episode of Huddle Up with Mark, the Fund Coach. I am Mark Duncan. I'm excited to be talking about this topic today because if you're watching this and you're part of an established organization, you probably can relate to this. You probably have that one board member that holds things up, questions everything, maybe impedes progress, whatever. But today I want to talk about the pros and cons of the contrarian. Now, there are pros to this. I am certainly not going to sit here and say to you, you need to be free of that contrarian. I would not advocate for that at all, because you actually need that person on the board, right? So let's take a look at the pros of the contrarian first, and sort of examine why they are good to have around. So first off, they can provide a diversity of thought, right? They're not just going along to get through the meeting. They force the board to think critically, and they force the board to not just be a rubber stamp for whatever staff wants, right? It's important. It's important. They can prevent groupthink, right? Forcing individual board members to think critically about individual topics that they're talking about. They can be that person that finds the weak spots in whatever's being presented. They can drive higher standards about the organization, especially if they challenge assumptions and keep them honest, keeping the team honest. And they can help strengthen your case. So they can even advocate for you as the staff person, in terms of making sure that you win them over. They can be helpful. So those are just a few of the pros of having a contrarian on your board. Let's talk about the cons. I mentioned this earlier. They can be disruptive. They can take a meeting that you plan, right, and completely derail it with their questions, their concerns, their comments. They can slow decision making as a result of being disruptive. They can also lower morale. There's this sort of overwhelming presence of dread that can be in the room when the contrarian is in attendance at the meeting, in person or online. And bringing that morale down for the rest of the board or even staff, can be problematic. And then where it applies to fundraising, they can force, and this happens often, I've seen it throughout my career, fundraising paralysis. They can block, they can undermine, question, challenge all fundraising efforts. Now, in this case, what I have found to be fairly true is that these board members either are uncomfortable with the idea of raising dollars, and so they will throw up roadblocks to impede progress, or they really have a legitimate concern about what you're raising money for and the case for support and all of that, which is a good thing. They can also undermine staff confidence. So if they challenge staff in public, meaning in the board meeting, or in private, and they do so without a tone of respect, that can be detrimental, to the organization. So how do you manage the contrarian, right? We know that what the pros are. They're good to have around. I truly, truly believe that. There was an organization that I worked for where there was a very, very strong contrarian on the board, challenged almost everything that came up for discussion at the board. Now, in many ways, this person provided significant value because one of the things that we did was we anticipated in preparation for the meeting how this person was going to react to the topic. So if you can do that, that's the one thing I think is great about a contrarian, is because it really makes you think about what you're presenting at the board and making sure that you're anticipating those questions, concerns, those comments that will come from the contrarian so that you're prepared to respond to those. So that's one of the things that's really great about having that contrarian in the room and on the board. They can be really helpful in that regard. It's frustrating, it's stressful. I've been there. But at the end of the day, they challenge you to be prepared for them, which means you're even better prepared than you would be if you hadn't thought about their presence and their response to the topic at hand. But here's some suggestions on how to sort of manage that contrarian. It's always good to pull that person aside to have a one-on-one conversation with them. That can be on the phone, that can be in person by having coffee. As you know, I always advocate for executive directors to meet with board members at least 2 times a year. One, to check in, see how they're doing, do sort of a pulse check to make sure that they're doing okay. Because a lot of times board members will not speak up in board meetings. They'll be relatively quiet. They'll be very observant. And maybe there's no opportunity for them in the meeting to express how they feel about how things are going. So you do that pulse check with them to check in how, in terms of their experience, any feedback that they would offer, and so forth. But when you're dealing with the contrarian, you pull that person aside and you try to create an understanding of their perspective. You're trying to, for lack of a better phrase, you're trying to win them over, right? And not in a way that is dishonest. You're trying to truly understand their perspective and where they're coming from, and you want them to hear that you understand their perspective. See, most times when we have a contrarian, we dread, the meetings, we dread running into them, talking to them, and we wish that they would just resign or their term would be up or whatever. And I'm challenging you to not think that way. In fact, I'm challenging you to appreciate the contrarian that is on your board. You also want to reinforce the role of the board members in governance, right, by clarifying expectations. So sometimes contrarians can bring the board down from focusing on the 30,000-foot level all the way down to the ground. And that is not a good use of the board's time because staff is on the ground. You, as the executive director, should be hovering at around 5,000 feet, right? But you're taking your direction, the lead from the board who's at 30,000 feet, but staff is on the ground. When the contrarian brings the board on the ground, meaning in that micromanaging level, questioning actual activities and things that the staff is engaged in and how they're doing it and so on and so forth, which is really the role of the executive director to manage the day to day, perhaps through other direct reports. That's problematic. And so you want to make sure that you are clarifying those expectations. Best to do that during the orientation of new board members so that the board members themselves understand the role that they play, right? Which is really three things, right? They are to do three things as a body. One, and that one is to protect and safeguard the mission. Two is fiduciary oversight, and that's all the legal aspects of being a part of the board, making sure that the financials are correct, making sure that the programs that you're running are following, all the legal uh, things that are associated with that. Everything that the organization has to do and do correctly, the board has fiduciary oversight over. And then third, and the thing I love to talk about is fundraising, right? Those are the three primary areas where the board should be focusing. So when the executive director, when you come to the board and you have your report and you're sharing about activities and things that are going on, preface it, manage their expectations, and say this is for your information only. It is not up for debate, discussion, or vote. You're just sharing with them the things that are happening so that they can understand the inner workings of the work that you're doing to serve the people that you serve. Board's got to hang out up here. So one-on-one conversations, clarifying expectations, give them a role. What are their strengths? Use their strengths, right? Give them a role. Ask them to lead, a planning scenario, or ask them to lead something. Again, hanging out at that 30,000-foot level, but lean into their strengths and ask them to lead something where they're leveraging an area of expertise that is going to be beneficial to the board and ultimately to the organization. Next would be to set boundaries. And the boundaries have to come from the board chair. It can't come from you as the executive director. The board chair is the leader of this group of volunteers that has this oversight over your organization. So you want to make sure that you're managing that board chair so that he or she can manage the disruptions, all the things that happen with the contrarian in the room. And so it's coming from them and not the executive director. Okay. Really, really critical because that's their peer. The board chair is their peer, and they need to have control over the meeting and exert that control, not in a aggressive way, but in a firm, decisive way. Okay? And then you also want to have a sort of a board culture check. Okay. Again, this is important during orientation to ensure that the board's culture and values are healthy, and that when you are having conversations, that the dissent of those conversations are healthy. Okay. Healthy but not dominant. Right? Because the contrarian can again take over, a meeting. But again, I can't say this enough. I would take a board with a contrarian any day of the week versus a board that is just riding along smoothly, not challenging the executive director or not challenging decisions, votes, strategy, all those things. You want that person in the room because that person is going to raise, as challenging as it may be, as uncomfortable as it may be for you, that person is going to raise questions, concerns, make comments that should make you think. And if you do all of these things to manage and contain the contrarian, then you should have a productive and successful board. So if you thought I was going to come on here and tell you how to get rid of a contrarian, you're wrong. Embrace the contrarian. Do all the things that I just mentioned to be able to manage that relationship so that it is beneficial for your organization. And especially when it comes to fundraising, making sure that they understand that they have a responsibility. And that contrarian can be somebody who knows people who meet link, interest, and ability that can introduce you to them and ultimately be bringing in large gifts for your organization. I will tell you that one last story. The contrarian that I mentioned earlier was my best fundraising assistant at a volunteer level, hands down. This person introduced me to people who ultimately made 5-figure and 6-figure gifts to the organization. So, as much of a contrarian as this person was, they're very helpful and they understood the mission, they understood the assignment, and most importantly, they understood that this fundraising thing isn't just about the dollars. It's about what the dollars do for the people that you serve. I want to thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful to you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.